Welcome to Lunar Labs, where we make restful nights and blissful dreams. Now get comfy for a relaxing story. Hello, my name is Emily, and tonight I have a special story to share with you. So settle in, get cozy, and let your mind drift into the calm and tranquil world we're about to explore. Picture yourself wrapped in a warm blanket, surrounded by the gentle glow of twilight, as we journey together into the heart of a timeless mystery. This is a tale of a secluded cabin deep in the woods of Elkwood, a place where the boundaries of time blur and the past and present intertwine. Through the eyes of three remarkable individuals, we'll uncover the secrets of this magical cabin, where love, loss, and hope echo through the ages. As you listen, allow yourself to relax and let your imagination wander. Feel the cool forest air, hear the rustling leaves, and sense the whispers of history carried on the breeze. Now let's begin our adventure with Amelia Harper, a journalist whose insatiable curiosity leads her to a discovery that will change her life forever. Welcome to the story of the time-travelling cabin in the woods. Part 1. The Discovery. The cabin in the woods had been there for as long as anyone in the small town of Elkwood could remember, but few had ever dared to venture near it. Shrouded in local legend and tales of mystery, it stood as a silent sentinel, hidden deep within the forest where the trees grew thick and the light barely pierced the canopy. It was said to be cursed or haunted or both, depending on who was telling the story. But for Amelia Harper, it was a beacon of possibility. Amelia was a journalist, known for her investigative prowess and her unquenchable curiosity. When she first heard about the cabin, it was through an old newspaper clipping she found in the town's dusty archives. The article, yellowed and brittle, told of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances linked to the cabin. The date on the clipping was 1923. Intrigued, Amelia decided to dig deeper, not realizing how deep the rabbit hole would go. She started by interviewing the town's elderly residents, those who had lived through decades of changes and remembered the old tales. Most were reluctant to speak, their eyes widening in fear at the mere mention of the cabin. But Mrs. Granger, a spry 87-year-old with a sharp mind, was different. She had grown up in Elkwood and had stories of her own to tell. "It's not just a cabin," Mrs. Granger said, her voice a hushed whisper despite the emptiness of her living room. "It's a doorway. My father used to talk about it, how he once stepped inside and found himself in another time. He never told anyone else, fearing they'd think him mad." Amelia's heart raced. A doorway to another time? It sounded absurd, but she had learned to keep an open mind. She asked Mrs. Granger for more details, which the old woman provided reluctantly. Her father, it seemed, had discovered the cabin by accident while hunting. He had stumbled through its door and emerged into the past, a past where the town of Elkwood was just a scattering of homesteads. "He saw things," Mrs. Granger continued, her eyes distant as she recounted her father's story. "People he recognized from old photographs, places that no longer existed. He said he only stayed for a short while before returning, but it changed him. He warned me never to go there, but I always wondered." Amelia thanked Mrs. Granger and left, her mind swirling with possibilities. She spent the next few days preparing for her journey into the woods, packing supplies and doing her best to map out the location based on vague descriptions from her interviews. Finally, with a mix of excitement and trepidation, she set out for the cabin. The forest was dense and foreboding, each step taking her deeper into a realm where time seemed to stand still. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, and the sounds of the outside world faded away. After hours of trekking, she spotted it, the cabin standing silently among the trees, its wooden walls weathered and moss-covered. Part 2. Echoes Through Time. Jacob Thorne was a man defined by loss. An antique dealer by trade, he had always been drawn to the past, finding solace in the stories and lives embedded within old furniture, dusty books and forgotten trinkets. But when his wife Clara passed away unexpectedly, the past took on a more profound significance. He sought not just to remember, but to relive, to find a way to bring her back, even if only for a moment. Jacob had heard whispers of the cabin in Elkwood, tales of its mysterious properties and the strange occurrences surrounding it. Initially dismissing them as fanciful legends, he paid no heed, but grief has a way of changing one's perspective. When he stumbled upon Amelia Harper's article about the cabin, complete with detailed accounts of her time-travelling experience, something ignited within him, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Determined to see if the cabin held the answers he sought, Jacob gathered what little information he could find and made his way to Elkwood. The journey felt surreal, as if he were walking through the pages of a forgotten storybook. The town had an old-world charm, with its quaint houses and cobblestone streets, but there was an undercurrent of melancholy, as if it too mourned a lost past. He arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting, its golden rays filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the forest floor. The cabin stood silent and imposing, a relic of a bygone era. Jacob hesitated at the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was much as Amelia had described, dusty, cobweb-covered, and eerily still. The grandfather clock stood in the centre, its hands frozen at midnight. Jacob approached it cautiously, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch its face. The moment he made contact, the air around him seemed to shimmer and warp. Colours blurred and a rush of wind filled his ears. When the world steadied, he found himself standing in the same cabin, but it was no longer abandoned. Everything was pristine, the furniture polished and the air filled with the scent of fresh wood and burning candles. Jacob stepped outside and was greeted by a bustling scene from another time. People dressed in early 20th century clothing moved about, and horse-drawn carriages clattered along the cobblestone streets. He had travelled back, just as Amelia had. For a moment he stood in awe, absorbing the sights and sounds of a world long gone. Then he remembered why he was there. Clara. He needed to find her. He began walking through the town, his eyes scanning every face, his heart aching with longing. But as the hours passed and he saw no sign of her, doubt began to creep in. What if she wasn't here? What if he had come all this way for nothing? Desperation drove him to the town square where a small crowd had gathered. He pushed his way to the front and saw a young woman standing on a makeshift stage, addressing the crowd. She was beautiful with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with determination. For a moment Jacob's heart leaped. She looked so much like Clara. But as he drew closer, he realized she wasn't his wife. Still, there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. He listened as she spoke passionately about workers' rights and social justice, her voice clear and strong. It struck him that she resembled a woman from an old photograph Clara had once shown him, a great-aunt who had been a prominent activist in the early 1900s. Could it be her? After the speech, Jacob approached her, his mind racing with questions. "Excuse me, miss," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't help but notice your resemblance to someone I know. Might you have family from around these parts?" The woman looked at him curiously. "I'm not sure, sir. My name is Margaret Harper. I've lived in Elkwood my whole life, but I'd be happy to help you if I can." Harper, the name struck a chord. Amelia Harper. Could there be a connection? Jacob decided to take a chance. My name is Jacob Thorne. I'm an antique dealer from the future. I know it sounds insane, but I've travelled back in time through a cabin in these woods. I'm looking for my wife, Clara, and I believe she might have some connection to your family. Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, she nodded slowly. I've heard stories about that cabin, she said. My grandmother used to tell me tales of time travellers and lost souls. She believed our family was somehow tied to the cabin's magic. If what you're saying is true, perhaps we can help each other. Jacob felt a surge of hope. Please, he said, his voice trembling, anything you can do. Margaret led him to her home, a charming house filled with books and old photographs. She pulled out a worn leather journal and began flipping through its pages. This belonged to my grandmother, she explained. She kept detailed records of her encounters with the cabin and the people who came through it. As they read through the journal, Jacob discovered entries about various individuals who had travelled through time, each with their own stories and reasons. Some sought knowledge, others escape, and some, like him, were searching for lost loved ones. One entry in particular caught his attention. It described a man who had come through the cabin in search of his wife, only to find that she had lived and died in another time, their paths never crossing again. The realization hit him like a blow. What if Clara was out there, but he would never find her? What if their timelines were forever misaligned? He buried his face in his hands, despair washing over him. Margaret placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Don't lose hope, Jacob. The cabin's magic is unpredictable, but it's also powerful. If you're meant to find Clara, you will. Jacob nodded, trying to hold on to that glimmer of hope. He spent the next few days in Elkwood, continuing his search and learning more about the Harper family's connection to the cabin. Margaret proved to be an invaluable ally, her knowledge of the town's history and her grandmother's journal guiding him. One evening, as they pored over the journal together, Margaret paused and looked at Jacob thoughtfully. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said. "Have you considered that Clara might have left something for you, a message or a clue, knowing that you might come looking for her?" Jacob hadn't thought of that. The possibility that Clara might have left a breadcrumb for him filled him with renewed determination. They scoured the journal for any mention of Clara or anything that seemed out of place. Finally, they found it. A cryptic entry from the 1920s mentioning a woman who appeared out of nowhere, speaking of a man she loved who would one day come for her. The entry ended with a location, the old church on the outskirts of town. The next morning, Jacob and Margaret made their way to the church. It was a beautiful, ancient structure, its stained glass windows casting colourful patterns on the stone floor. Jacob's heart pounded as he searched for any sign of Clara. They found a small alcove near the back, hidden from view. Inside, Jacob discovered a box with his name on it. Hands trembling, he opened it to find a letter and a locket. The letter, written in Clara's familiar handwriting, brought tears to his eyes. "My dearest Jacob, if you're reading this, then you found the cabin and travelled through time, just as I hoped you would. I'm so sorry we were separated, but know that I've loved you in every moment of every day. I couldn't find a way back, but I've left this for you, a piece of our love that transcends time. The locket belonged to my great-aunt Margaret, the woman you met in town. She told me stories of her own encounters with the cabin, and it seems our fates were intertwined long before we met. Hold on to it, and know that our love is timeless." With all my heart, Clara Jacob clutched the locket, tears streaming down his face. He could feel Clara's presence, her love, enveloping him. Though they were separated by time, their bond remained unbroken. He looked at Margaret, who watched him with a mix of sadness and understanding. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Margaret smiled softly. "Love is the greatest magic of all, Jacob. It transcends time, space, and even death. Never forget that." Jacob returned to the cabin, the locket warm in his hand. He knew he couldn't bring Clara back, but he had found a piece of her, a connection that would never fade. As he stepped back through the doorway and returned to his own time, he felt a sense of peace. The past was not a place to live in, but a part of who he was, a part of who they were. Back in his antique shop, Jacob placed the locket in a special display, a symbol of love's enduring power. He continued his work, finding joy in the stories of the past and helping others discover their own connections. And every now and then he would think of the cabin in the woods, the place where time and love intertwined, and where he found his heart again. Amelia approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and touched the door, half expecting it to crumble under her fingers. Instead, it felt solid and strangely warm. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, but intact. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, casting eerie shadows on the floor. She walked through the rooms, her footsteps echoing softly. There was nothing overtly unusual, just the remnants of a bygone era. Then, in the centre of the main room, she saw it, an old grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight. She felt a strange pull, an urge to touch it. As her fingers brushed the clock's face, the room began to spin. Colours blurred and a rush of wind filled her ears. She closed her eyes against the dizziness, and when she opened them again, everything had changed. She was still in the cabin, but it was different. The dust and cobwebs were gone, the furniture polished and new. Through the window she saw a bustling scene, people in old-fashioned clothing, horse-drawn carriages, and a landscape unmarred by modernity. She had done it. She had travelled back in time. For a moment Amelia stood in stunned silence, absorbing the reality of what she was experiencing. She had always been fascinated by history, and now she was living it. But she knew she had to be cautious. Blending in would be crucial, and finding out more about the cabin's secret even more so. She slipped outside, careful to avoid drawing attention to herself. The town looked different, yet familiar. It was Elkwood, but from another era, perhaps the early 1900s. She wandered through the streets, listening to conversations and observing the way people moved and interacted. She marvelled at the simplicity of life, the absence of modern technology, and the sense of community. As she explored, she realised that the cabin wasn't just a doorway to the past. It was a key to understanding the present. The stories she had heard, the tales of disappearances and strange occurrences, all made sense now. People had been using the cabin for decades, perhaps centuries, each with their own reasons, and each leaving their mark on the fabric of time. Amelia spent the day in the past, soaking in as much as she could. She visited the town square, the general store, and even spoke to a few locals, careful to keep her questions vague and her modern sensibilities hidden. She learned that the town was thriving, full of life and promise, a stark contrast to the sleepy, decaying place it had become. As the sun began to set, she knew it was time to return. She made her way back to the cabin, her mind racing with ideas for her article and the implications of what she had discovered. She entered the cabin and touched the grandfather clock once more, feeling the familiar rush of wind and the dizzying spin of colours. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the present, the cabin old and decrepit once again. Amelia's heart was pounding, but she felt a sense of triumph. She had unlocked the secret of the cabin, and she knew her story would be groundbreaking. But more than that, she felt a deep connection to the past, to the people who had lived and loved and struggled in the same place she now called home. She understood now that time was not a linear path, but a tapestry of moments, each connected by the choices and actions of those who came before. She left the cabin with a new sense of purpose, determined to uncover more about its history and the lives it had touched. She knew there were others out there, like Mrs. Granger's father, who had experienced the cabin's magic and had stories to tell. And she was ready to find them, to piece together the puzzle of the time-travelling cabin in the woods. Part 3. The Guardian of Time. The small town of Elkwood had always been steeped in mystery, its heart beating in rhythm with the ancient trees that encircled it. The cabin in the woods, with its hidden power to traverse time, had seen many visitors, each leaving their indelible mark, yet its true nature remained shrouded in secrecy, known to a select few who understood the delicate balance it maintained. One of those few was an old man named Thomas Barrett, the cabin's guardian. Thomas had been aware of the cabin's power since his youth. He came from a long line of guardians, each entrusted with the knowledge and responsibility of protecting the cabin and ensuring that its magic was not misused. As a young man, Thomas had made a vow to safeguard the cabin, a promise that had shaped his entire life. Now, in his 70s, Thomas lived a quiet, reclusive life on the outskirts of Elkwood. His small cottage, filled with artifacts and books chronicling the cabin's history, was his sanctuary. He watched over the cabin with a weary but vigilant eye, knowing that its power could both heal and harm. He had seen people come and go, each with their own story, their own reasons for stepping through the cabin's door. And now, with the recent visits by Amelia Harper and Jacob Thorne, he sensed that something significant was unfolding. It was a warm autumn afternoon when Amelia Harper returned to Elkwood. She had spent the past few months researching the cabin's history and the people who had encountered its magic. Her article had garnered widespread attention, drawing curious seekers and scholars alike. But it had also attracted the attention of those who sought to exploit the cabin's power for their own gain. Amelia knew she needed to protect the cabin and its secrets, and she believed Thomas Barrett could help. She found him in his garden, tending to a bed of late-blooming flowers. He looked up as she approached, his sharp blue eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mr. Barrett?" Amelia began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "My name is Amelia Harper. I believe you know about the cabin in the woods. I need your help to protect it." Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I've read your article, Miss Harper. You've stirred quite a bit of interest in our little town. Come inside and we can talk." Inside the cottage, surrounded by relics of the past, Amelia explained her concerns. She spoke of the people she had encountered, the stories she had uncovered, and her fear that the cabin's power could fall into the wrong hands. Thomas listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The cabin is a conduit, a point where time intersects and folds upon itself. It has always been protected by those who understand its significance. But you're right, its existence is a delicate balance. If misused, it could disrupt the very fabric of time." Amelia nodded, relief washing over her. "What can we do to safeguard it?" Thomas stood and walked to a dusty bookshelf, pulling out an old, leather-bound book. He handed it to Amelia. "This contains the history of the cabin and the role of its guardians. You must understand its rules and limitations, but more importantly, we need to ensure that only those with pure intentions can access it." As they pored over the book, Thomas shared his own experiences and the knowledge passed down through generations. He spoke of the sacrifices made by previous guardians and the trust placed upon them. Amelia listened, absorbing the weight of the responsibility she was about to share. Meanwhile, Jacob Thorne had also returned to Elkwood. His journey to the past and his reunion with Clara's memory had given him a new purpose. He felt a connection to the cabin that went beyond his personal quest. He wanted to help preserve its magic, to honour Clara's legacy and the love they shared. Jacob found Amelia and Thomas deep in discussion at the cottage. He explained his desire to assist them to ensure that the cabin remained a source of wonder and healing, not a tool for exploitation. Together, the three of them formed an unlikely alliance, united by their shared mission. Over the following weeks, they devised a plan to protect the cabin. They established a network of trusted townspeople who understood the importance of the cabin and could help monitor any suspicious activity. They also created a set of guidelines drawn from the ancient book to determine who could access the cabin. These guidelines emphasized the purity of intent, the need for respect, and the understanding of the potential consequences. As they worked, Amelia, Jacob, and Thomas grew closer, their bond strengthened by their shared purpose. They spent long evenings discussing history, time, and the nature of human desire. Thomas, in particular, found solace in their company, grateful for the companionship after years of solitude. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned golden and the air carried a hint of winter, they decided to visit the cabin together. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to solidify their commitment to protecting its secrets. They walked through the forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the birdsong above, creating a serene backdrop. When they reached the cabin, it stood as it always had, silent, timeless, and full of mystery. Thomas approached the door first, his hand resting on the weathered wood. He turned to Amelia and Jacob, a faint smile on his lips. "This place has seen so much," he said softly. "It holds the echoes of countless lives and stories. We are but its current guardians, a small part of a much larger tapestry." Amelia and Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of his words. They entered the cabin together, the familiar rush of wind and blurring colours enveloping them. When the world steadied, they found themselves in the same place, yet subtly different. It was a reminder of the cabin's power and the responsibility they carried. Inside, they took a moment to reflect. Amelia thought of the stories she had uncovered, the people whose lives had been touched by the cabin. Jacob held the locket Clara had left him, feeling her presence as strongly as ever. And Thomas, the lifelong guardian, felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the cabin would continue to be protected by those who truly understood its significance. As they left the cabin and made their way back to town, they were greeted by the sight of Elkwood in its autumnal glory. The town had always been a place where past and present intertwined, and now, with the cabin's guardians united, its future felt secure. In the months that followed, Amelia published a follow-up article, carefully crafted to celebrate the cabin's mystery while emphasizing the importance of respecting its power. Jacob continued his work as an antique dealer, but he also became a storyteller, sharing the cabin's history and the lessons he had learned. And Thomas, though older and slower, remained a vigilant guardian, guiding the next generation and ensuring that the cabin's magic endured. The cabin in the woods, with its ability to traverse time, remained a beacon of possibility and wonder. It continued to touch the lives of those who sought it out, each visitor leaving their own mark on the tapestry of time. And as the seasons changed and years passed, the cabin stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, memory, and the human spirit. Elkwood thrived, its residents cherishing the stories and history that defined their town. They understood that the cabin was more than just a place. It was a symbol of the connections that bound them across time and space. And for Amelia, Jacob, and Thomas, the cabin had become a part of their souls, a reminder that the past was always with them, guiding their steps into the future. And so the story of the time-travelling cabin in the woods continued, an eternal echo of those who had come before and those who would come after, each chapter adding to the rich tapestry of time.